With P-40s being one of my favourite subjects, it's time to experience a kit I've not tried before. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I build and review the Hella P-40 in 1/72 scale. For a deeper dive inside the box to take a look at the contents of this kit, check out my dedicated unboxing video. In this one I'm going to be focusing on what this kit is like to build and rounding off with a summary at the end. It is worth noting that the kit I've got here is actually the starter set version, which has a few paints and things included. However, it doesn't really have the right paints for the version I want to do, so whilst they will make an appearance, and we'll talk about that a bit later on, this isn't going to be a starter set build. As usual, I'll put a list of the products I did use on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to go and get if you fancy replicating what you see in this video. And without any further ado, let's get into it. As usual, I'll cut the parts away from the sprue using my cutter or a sharp knife for the smaller details. There is a little bit of flash and some mould gates which will need to be cleaned up, and this was done carefully by sanding away with a sanding stick or scraping away with a knife. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice throughout this build, and the first step was to assemble the various cockpit details. I say various because there's more than one, but there's not that many. The control column was glued into the cockpit floor, and then a rear bulkhead part was added. There is a pilot seat, but I will paint that before adding it on. And speaking of painting, I'm going to use this Vallejo uniform green. The painting instructions actually called for a grass green colour, and this was the closest facsimile I had. It might be a little bit vibrant, but I think it'll do. This was painted onto the bare plastic on all the internal areas of the aircraft. This included the cockpit fuselage sidewalls and the pilot's seat I've yet to attach. One of the included paints in this set was the Hella 110 natural wood colour. This is the only time it will make an appearance, and I used it on the headrest for the pilot. I didn't think much of this paint, with the opacity being pretty poor, and this was despite mixing it quite thoroughly. Humbrol number 32, which is a dark grey, would be used to pick out the top of the control column, and also the top half of the control panel. There are some decals included for the internal areas, so I'm going to use some Mr. Mark Softer to help apply them. Having selected and cut the relevant decals from the sheet, they were soaked in warm water, and then some Mr. Mark Softer was used to help soften them into the surface details. You get a decal for the control panel, and also some seat belts, which is quite nice, as this is quite a cheap kit, and you wouldn't necessarily expect to see them in something this cheap. With that done, the seat was glued into position on the cockpit assembly. And then this could be glued into position on the lower wing half. The control panel, on the other hand, would be glued into one of the fuselage halves. This retaining part here is for the propeller. This just gives it a mounting point. You could technically have a freely rotating prop if you glued it in at this point. Being careful, of course, with your cement, you could have it freely rotate. However, I'm going to keep mine off and attach it at the end. There is also an air intake part which needs to be glued into position at the bottom of the undernose scoop. And with that done, the two fuselage halves would join together. The fit is moderate, but I did notice a little bit of a misalignment, so I did run my sanding stick along this to try and smooth it all out. Turning my attention back to the wings, the upper wing parts could then be glued onto the lower wing. This assembly can then be glued onto the fuselage components. It was a little bit snug, and I did have to shave a little bit of material away in a few places just to get it to fit correctly. The tail surfaces were glued into their slots at the back of the model, And then these blanking components for the front of the landing gear bays were glued onto the leading edges of the wings. The wings do have a bit of a gap at the wing root, so to address this I'm going to use some Ammo MIG putty surfacer in medium consistency. This liquid filler was painted onto the offending areas, working it into the gaps and building up a few layers until they were virtually invisible. When that was dry, I would carefully sand down these areas to make the seam blend in and look less noticeable. I do have to be careful though to make sure I don't remove too many of the raised rivet details. Although this is an old kit and it does feature raised details, I kind of want to preserve them. The propeller assembly is fairly straightforward, with the propeller being glued onto the back plate, and then the spinner being attached over the top. There is a belly drop tank as well, which comes in two halves, and this was glued together. I will leave this off for now and attach it after painting. The landing gear bay doors are attached at this point. This was a little bit fiddly to get them in the right places. There isn't that much in the way of positive locating points on this kit. Everything almost just has to go where it goes, and it's quite easy to misalign things due to these lack of locating points. With that done, I turned my attention to the tail wheel bay. I glued into place the landing gear leg and then the doors on the sides of the bay. These are attached in the open position as well, and whilst there is technically no raised landing gear option included in the kit, I think that with some modification you might be able to replicate that. But it's not something that is native to the model. In front of the cockpit there is a small ring sight, which I glued into place here. And with that, it's now time to prime. I have masked up the cockpit area so I don't get any paint in the wrong places, and I'm going to use this Army Painter Matte Black as my primer. This was sprayed over the entire aircraft and the assemblies which have not yet been added, and should give a nice uniform base for the next layers of paint to stick to. I did almost forget about the cockpit canopies though. These clear parts have already been masked in my normal method, which is to apply tape and then cut along the canopy lines using a sharp knife, and this was also given a quick prime with the black paint. Now onto the camouflage colours. For the lower side of the aircraft I'm going to use this Vallejo Neutral Grey. Although this is a airbrush ready paint, I do find adding a drop of thinner does help prevent tip dry. I'm not too fussed about doing any pre-shading or anything in this kit. It is meant to be sort of a quick project, almost like a weekend build. I think you could really do this in a day if you fancied it. So I'm just going to build up a fairly uniform colour for my paint scheme. I've also decided to go for this paint scheme because these are colours that I already had in the stash, and it is a little bit simpler than the Kittyhawk variants in the Royal Australian Air Force schemes. For the upper surfaces I'm going to go for this US Air Force olive drab, and you can see that I have already carefully masked the lower edges. Again, this was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over to create a uniform layer of paint. This is definitely the simpler of the paint schemes included, as it's just two-tone. However, it might be a little bit trickier when we come to the decals. I did need to make sure, of course, not to forget to paint the canopies as well. And so, moving on to the aforementioned decals. You get 3 different decal schemes included. One for the US Army Air Force and 2 for the Royal Australian Air Force. So the US version is technically a P-40E Warhawk, whilst the Australian versions are going to be Kittyhawks. I identified the relevant decals that I needed and cut them from the sheet. As is quite standard with Hella decals, the decal film actually extends quite a bit of a way around the outsides of the decals, and sometimes it joins them together. I took a little bit of time to make sure that no decals were joined to other decals, and also on the case of the Tiger artwork, I cut down the centre to make sure that I could install the engine exhausts in this position later on. The decals were then soaked in warm water to help release them from the backing paper. And if you keep getting your brush water mixed up with your cup of tea, just like I do, why not get a brush water mug, so you never make that mistake again. check out my merch store and it helps support the channel. So the decal application was relatively straightforward. These are Hella's standard kind of decals. They're not the best quality in the world. There are manufacturers out there with better quality decals. The printing is okay. The general design and size is pretty accurate and actually fits quite well. It's just the kind of overall quality of them. If you don't get them in exactly the right place to start with, they become a bit more stubborn to move, and then with some manipulation they end up becoming very flaky and you could rip them. So you kind of have to get them in the right place on the first go. The problems with the excess decal film is also slightly annoying. I went through and applied the decals to all the relevant places as indicated on the painting instructions, and then would apply some of the Mr. Hobby Mr. Mark Softer over the top to soften them into the surface details. I find this particular liquid actually works really well on Hella decals. In this particular kit they did actually soften into the majority of the raised details quite nicely. It is worth noting that there are quite a few stencils included in the kit, but as I experienced with my Hellcat some time ago, they don't actually provide that much extra value. They are little more than just blobs of text. The words aren't legible, and I don't think they're going to add anything really to this kit. So what I decided to do was find the ones which were the largest or possibly the most colourful and applied those instead, opting to just leave the rest of them off because I didn't see the point in adding them. And with that done, I would leave the decals to cure overnight, and then returning in the morning, I applied some of this custom service satin varnish. This is an airbrush ready paint. I think it's just K colours but rebranded, and this was airbrushed over the entire model to help seal in the decals. This should help protect them in the next stages and give a more uniform finish. Whilst that varnish is drying, I'm going to use this Outlaw Yellow on the propeller assembly. The spinner needs to be yellow. This isn't quite the most accurate shade as indicated in the painting instructions, but I think it will do. And then another paint which was included in the box is number 33 Matte Black. I'm going to use this on the propeller blades, and despite giving it a good thorough mix, you can see that once again the same problem of opacity has presented itself. This will take quite a number of different coats in order to build up a good uniform finish, which is surprising because a black paint is usually one coat and you're done. Just for comparison, I'm going to use this Vallejo Matte Black instead and see what this looks like with only one coat. And as you can see, this one performs much better. This actually covers up all the yellow on the propeller blades. So yeah, these Hella paints are not the best in the world, and I probably won't be getting the starter set versions again in the future. I decided to finish off the rest of the blades using this Vallejo colour. Swinging back to the underside of the aircraft, I didn't actually bother to mask up the landing gear bays. It wasn't really an oversight on my part, I just couldn't be bothered. There's no details in there anyway, it's pretty much just a hole in the bottom of the plane. So I decided it would just be easier to get the green that I used earlier and just paint it back on. I did this carefully and also made sure to catch the internal areas of the landing gear bay covers as well. The next paint I'm going to use is this matte aluminium. I used this on the landing gear legs, which are still yet to be added to the aircraft, and also the engine exhausts as a base colour. For the engine exhausts I want to make them look a little more burnt though, so I added some of this dirty down rust colour, which I have thinned down with water, over the top to give it a bit of a glaze. It should make it look a little bit more realistic. For a little bit of weathering, I'm going to mix up some of this Humbrol number 79 blue-grey enamel paint with some white spirit. This is my favourite homemade wash at the moment, and I would paint this over the entire aircraft. This should help add an extra layer of contrast, dirt and grime, and being as thin as it is, I didn't see the need to remove any once it had dried. However, if there was any excess I wasn't happy with, I could carefully reactivate it with some more white spirit and then remove it with a cotton bud. The aluminium paint I used earlier would be used on a dry brush to add some chipping. This is a very simple technique just to give the impression that paint has been worn away in various areas of the aircraft during maintenance or operation. As this model features raised details, dry brushing it over some of them would help catch on the raised panel lines and rivets and give a little bit more of a three-dimensional effect to them. Moving on, this K-Colors matte varnish was loaded into the airbrush and then sprayed over the entire model. This is going to dull down that shine from the satin paint I applied earlier, making everything appear a little bit flatter and blending everything together. To add some smoke staining, I'm going to mix in some of this Vallejo Model Air Black to my matte varnish to make a very thin black paint. This was then carefully airbrushed over the gun port areas to give the impression of smoke staining from the guns being used, and also to the engine exhausts. Perhaps I went a little bit too heavy with this in a few places, but actually it doesn't look too bad in my opinion. After all, a kit like this is great for practicing different techniques. And if I didn't get it quite right here, I'll probably get it right on another, better model. The final things that need to be assembled are the landing gear legs, which have an interesting design. I think originally this was designed so that the tyres could rotate and add a bit of play value, but I'm not too fussed about that. I'm just going to glue the tyres onto the landing gear legs, and then the hub, which I've already painted in yellow, is glued over the top. This isn't necessarily a bad way of designing the landing gear, because it means that you've got fairly neat boundaries between the different painted parts. The tail wheel is basically just a ring, and that gets glued onto the leg at the back of the aircraft. And then the main landing gear would be glued into position at the front of the aircraft. Again, this is one of those parts which don't really have like a positive locating point. There is like a molded lump on the inside, but it's not a hole or anything. You kind of have to line it up and it just press fits. It's just a butt joint. It just doesn't, if you're not careful, you're going to knock this off. So I had to leave this for a while to make sure it had fully cured. The engine exhausts could then be glued into their slots on the side of the aircraft, and I'm glad that I cut the decal film there earlier because this was a lot easier with it not being in the way. And then I carefully removed all of the masking which I put inside of the cockpit area. This means I can move on to the canopy parts. The canopy parts also have their masks removed, and these homemade masks have done a reasonable job. Pretty happy with the results here. So I can glue them onto the aircraft using some Clearfix. Clearfix is a clear glue which won't react with the plastic, but it is a bit stringy, so I'm going to have to be a little bit careful with how I use it and not make a mess. With the glue applied, the rear windows were added onto the back of the model, making sure to get them on the right sides. The front windscreen was added at the front of the aircraft cockpit area, and then the main canopy was glued in as well. It is worth noting that although this part comes as a separate entity, it can't actually be glued in the open position. I did try, it just doesn't fit. And I didn't really want to force it and cause any problems. Flipping back over to the lower side, that belly drop tank needs to be glued into the holes in the bottom. These holes are always present, so if you don't want to add this part, you'll have to fill those holes in. And the final step was to glue into place the propeller on the nose of the aircraft. And with that, I'm going to call my build of the Hella P-40 in 1/72nd scale complete. And that's another build under the belt. So whilst I do enjoy building P-40 model kits, this is probably not one of my most favourite builds so far. As normal, I'm probably going to talk about the things that I didn't like so much about this kit and then swing back into the more positive aspects. So starting off, I do have some questions about the accuracy of this kit. To my eye, it does look a little bit long, almost like it's been a little bit stretched. I think the P-40E was a relatively long aircraft anyway, but I feel that this one is maybe just a little bit too long. But I did kind of compare it to some drawings just by eye, and it looks okay. It just doesn't look quite right to me. Perhaps maybe the landing gear is a little bit too short, and it just makes it look a little bit off, in my opinion. Yes, this kit is a fairly old tooling, and it does feature some raised rivet details, which were typical of that time period. The fit of the parts is acceptable mostly, but there are some gaps and seams that need to be sorted out. And there is a lack of positive mounting location for some of the parts as well, which means you are pretty much just guessing if they're in the right place. There's no landing gear bay details, no option to raise the landing gear without modifying the kit, and no pilot included. Hella isn't in the habit of including display stands, so having this in a flying pose is something that would have to be customised by the modeller. Additionally, the cockpit can't be positioned open. I did try and have a look to see if it would work, but the main canopy component just doesn't fit in the open position. So again, without modification, that's not an option. The decals do suffer from Hella's normal problems, being that they are a little bit papery and a bit flaky if you don't get them in the right place and have to manipulate them, and not to mention that the excess decal film tends to join decals together and needs cutting to make sure that you do actually have separate transfers. The printing on them was actually relatively okay, but the smaller stencils, as mentioned earlier, were just little more than blobs, so I didn't see the point in adding them because I didn't think it would add much to the build. Those are primarily the negative aspects of this kit, and whilst it wasn't a relatively complicated build, there were times where I just didn't really feel like I was enjoying it. I did go for the more simple paint scheme, as I thought I'd be able to make quite quick progress. I do keep a note of everything that I do in my modelling journal, which is a book I've created to keep a track of my own progress on the workbench, and if you'd like to keep a log of your own builds, feel free to check out the links below the video to grab your own copies. In here I did write down that this took me about a week to complete, but that was primarily because I was busy with other commitments. I think generally you could possibly build this in a weekend or even in a single day if you work quite quickly. It's not an overly complicated kit, and as it only features 43 parts, and if you build it in the simple paint scheme that I did here, you could make very quick progress. I do like that this kit comes with 3 different paint schemes. Whilst I say different a little bit loosely, the first 2 paint schemes are quite similar, it is good value having that choice. As I went for the starter kit version, I did get some paints included as well. Unfortunately, as we saw, the opacity of those paints were not great, and actually I barely even used them. The black paint would have been used perhaps on the tyres and the propeller blades, and the natural wood was used on the headrest. I think this was aimed a little bit more at the other paint schemes for the Australian versions, but this just swings back to Hella. When they have a starter kit, it's not really a starter kit in the sense that you can actually just build to the basic standard of the model straight out of the box. They just chuck in some random paints which are listed on the suggested paint colour callout, but you can't really create a kit to its basic standard with what's included in the box, which is why I went for my own colours. But yes, on a positive note, it is good that you get 3 decal schemes included, and I think in the future I probably won't be buying the starter kit versions of models from Hella, because there's just no guarantee with those paints. A positive that I did like was that the instructions were printed in full colour, which made painting this kit and applying the decals much easier. The rear of the box tells you the tooling dates as well, so actually I went into this fully expecting a pretty old and a little bit tatty of a kit, which I think is good transparency, and more model kit companies should follow this practice. So on the back of the box it tells us that this was a 1972 tooling, and from what I've seen here in this model kit, I would say that this is a pretty contemporary tooling for that era. The level of detail was reasonable, but naturally of a raised variety, but the version I have here was released back in 2024. I think the main positive aspect of this kit is its retail price. Normally, the recommended retail price for the starter kit version I have here is €9.99, which if we convert to GBP is a little under £9. So for a kit with 3 paint schemes and actually some paints and stuff included, that's pretty good value. Of course, if you don't want to get the version with paints, it's a little bit cheaper again. So this is definitely a pocket money kit that you could buy to practice your skills and try out new products and techniques if you wanted to. So despite the fact that this kit does have its problems, some of which can be relatively easily overcome, for the price, I'm not sure I can complain too much. I'm not sure that I would purchase this particular kit again, but I'm glad that I've had the opportunity to experience it. And with that, I'm going to end this video here. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of my build and whether my assessment of this kit was fair. Don't forget that we have a Model Minutes Model Club, and if you'd like to get early access to videos and other perks, check out the links in the description. Massive thanks to these Model Club members on the screen here for the extra support they give the channel. I'd like to welcome our latest members to the club. They are KDO Potato and Daryl Drury. Thanks for joining us. There are other ways to help support the channel if you would prefer, and again, full information is below the video, but the best way to support the channel for free is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you for watching this one, and I'll catch you on the workbench again next time.